Hello and welcome. I'm conductor Raffaele Ponti, and this is Behind the Notes. Today, my very special guest is saxophonist Timothy McAllister. Tim, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedule, and it's lovely to see you again.
It's great to see you. Thank you.
Let's start off right off the top. We got a lot to talk about because you have an incredible, multi-dimensional career and success in all areas. Let's start off with congratulations on your recent Grammy with the London Symphony Orchestra with Ken Fuchs' piece.
Oh, thank you so much. That was such a tremendous project. I was thrilled to be a part of it, and Ken certainly deserves the accolades for an amazing album of beautiful music that's truly American in nature.
I think it's wonderful the fact that people like Ken Fuchs and others for sure are continuing to grow the repertoire for your instrument, but also for the orchestra business and repertoire. I think this is really very vital and important. That's what's happening here. Let's talk about this first. The saxophone's really a baby in the instrument world. Don't you agree?
Absolutely, yeah. In the scheme of the canon of classical music, it is the most recent newcomer, certainly.
And it's not really regarded as what we consider an orchestral instrument. I mean, certainly the string section, we have the brass and winds, and there's only been a few composers that really have voiced this instrument into the orchestral repertoire and really done a really great job. Can we list a few of those?
Sure, right off the bat. I mean, the very first composer of note to write for the saxophone was Hector Berlioz, and he was the first major advocate for this instrument. He was a good friend of the inventor Adolphe Sax, we've heard his instruments time and time again because he perfected the modern bass clarinet. So when you think about that iconic excerpt from the Nutcracker of the descending chromatic sound of the bass clarinet, that was the instrument that intersected with Adolphe Sax's life. And so from then on, you start to see a lot of advocacy for his inventions. He was perfecting and refining brass instruments. He was improving the piston work of various brass instruments, and then he was experimenting with multiple bell instruments, and he was trying to find ways to make the instruments more efficient. But ultimately, he was trying to create this perfect bridge in his mind, that the gulf that existed between the wind section and the brass section, and he felt there was a missing voice there. And so his initial conception of the instrument for the saxophone was that it would be a low instrument, not necessarily the high instrument that we kind of associate it with, but that it would be something that would be a possible replacement for the very clunky, double bassoon, contrabassoon, and then something that would maybe have a little bit more agility than we might see with a tuba, for instance. So his initial idea was the bass family, the bass saxophone, the baritone saxophone. And so Berlioz wrote for the bass saxophone in the very first composition, and then several composers started to follow suit. And that's been the name of the game all along. If we can get the advocacy of composers to see the instrument in that way, then many will follow. And so there was a whole period of late 19th century composers that were interested. Many have fallen off in the in history, but names of note like Meyerbeer and even Rossini was an advocate for the instrument. He didn't write for it, but he wrote critically in his writings. He spoke very favorably of the instrument.
Right. I always find that with woodwinds and brass, for example, when the instrument first is developed or made, then there's a process where the mechanisms are in a certain fashion, the design is a certain way, and there's this threefold thing. And if you can address this, as players got better and more proficient, composers were able to write differently for them or more advanced for them. And like the clarinet, how that developed, the mechanism, and then as the instrument and the players got more advanced, then composers were more challenged with, well, they can do this, let me push them a little further. And it's constantly this feeding. And now you've brought this instrument to this pinnacle. How do you think that development happens? Which comes first, the instrument, the composer, or the player?
Well, that's an amazing question, really. I think throughout history we see the repertoire evolve with the instrument itself. Even if you look at the evolution of the harpsichord to through the forte piano into the pianoforte, you see the evolution of course, you know, the modern brass winds and woodwinds. I mean, we saw the additional key work, the additional range possibilities. You see better manufacturing practices. You see greater scientific research behind reed construction. So I certainly see that the composers and the performers were aligning their vision with how to push these instruments. Of course, you know, Mozart and Stadler, this famous relationship there, and the basset horn, the basset clarinet, the evolution of these instruments, like they essentially went from being more of a vocalese instrument to being a virtuosic instrument. And I think we saw the same thing with the saxophone. All of these early examples of orchestral writing for the instrument, Georges Bizet's Les Arlésiens, the excerpt of Ravel's Mussorgsky's Old Castle, these are all featuring the instrument in a very bel canto fashion. You know, the instrument was much more of a I wouldn't say it was a very agile instrument early on. It had this kind of deep, rich sound. The key work was there. The instrument isn't totally different than it was now, than it is now, but the mechanism itself relatively was still crude, much like you would see with the really early, you know, the proto clarinets. So that the sound of the instrument was much more akin to vocal writing and singing, a singing style. The severe nature of the conical bore of the instrument made it have almost a more voice-like quality. And Adolphe Sax knew that was the potential by creating a conical bore woodwind instrument made of brass. So he saw those potentials as having maybe that richer overtone series. But he ultimately wanted an instrument more accessible. We could talk about all of the virtue of his goals, but he was just trying to make a buck, you know. So he just wanted to sell more instruments. And clarinet had this troublesome overblow at the 12th, and so you basically had a key mechanism that was incongruous from octave to octave. And with the saxophone, like the oboe, basically it overblew at the octaves. And you could basically play the same notes in both octaves just with the register key. So he was just trying to make something more accessible in the end. Yeah.
Now the sax is like the human voice in its voicing. I mean, we have everything from the bass sax, is that the lowest one, or is there a double bass?
There is something called the contrabass saxophone. They're extremely rare. There have been composers to write for them, but write for this instrument. But it didn't go through this mass production that we saw all the other main family go through. So there's a primary family of 4 instruments. I have them here actually. So you have the smallest, which is the soprano saxophone. And so this instrument in its early days might have been seen as a curved instrument. So it was built both as a curved instrument and a straight instrument. So it's often confused by, you know, a layperson as being a gold clarinet. Okay, well, but the instrument could be built straight. And probably the most famous excerpt for this would be something like the Bolero of Ravel. But this would be the primary instrument of the family of 4: soprano, alto, tenor, baritone. There's a bass saxophone, which is in mass production, but it's very rare. You see a very famous excerpt in Strauss's Sinfonia Domestica. There's a bass saxophone part there. But then there is one instrument smaller called the Supranino Saxophone. So it's probably about almost quarter the size of this. And and so the next would be the alto saxophone, and I'll be happy to demonstrate these in a minute. But the alto saxophone, so this is the primary instrument we think of as our solo instrument, and it's built curved. If you were to straighten this instrument, it would be very problematic. It's much more difficult to play, but just in terms of weight and balance, but also because you can't disconnect, you can't take the instrument apart like you might a French horn. So your instrument cases become a factor in that, right? But the alto saxophone we think of as our primary solo instrument because it was the instrument that most composers decided to take up when they were writing for the saxophone. And most of our core actual classical literature is written for the alto saxophone.
What do you think that is? Was it a color choice that they gravitated to that color?
Yeah, I think it was that dark, that rich melancholy. If you think about that troubadour sound in the Old Castle, I think the soprano saxophone just had a little more of that nasal quality, and we already had sort of the higher winds represented in the orchestral sound. The English horn, oboe family, the flute family. We had that color covered in many ways. That alto saxophone has that richness that sits in a little deeper orchestration, right?
Right.
So I don't think the soprano was necessarily as popular in the orchestra world. The tenor saxophone would be next, and the tenor saxophone is quite larger, and we think of the tenor saxophone as the primary jazz instrument, really, because some of the greatest icons took this instrument up because it was a much deeper sound. It might really have been thought of as even closer to the human voice, because it had, if you were to play in the extended register of the tenor saxophone all the way down to its lowest extremes, it actually covers much more range than the alto saxophone, right? And then the largest of the primary family is the baritone, which I have here. And in the baritone saxophone, I mean, Gershwin was taking advantage of this. Ralph Vaughan Williams was taking advantage of the baritone saxophone. Holst, a lot of names. So this is the primary four family members that constitutes the saxophone quartet. So the saxophone quartet could be seen as a family within the band or within the orchestra, but it then became its own primary chamber music medium.
Did Sax himself design all the shapes and designs of these instruments all the way from the bottom to the top?
Yes, he did. If you see all of his original instruments, very easy. You can actually just do, nowadays we can just do a Google search on Adolphe Sax saxophones, and you can see the original instruments. Many, they've been photographed time and time again, and they look basically identical now. And he determined at what points to wrap the instrument, at what point would create the ideal position for the mouthpiece.
Wonderful. Is the mechanism the same on each instrument?
Yeah, that's always a great question, and it's always a challenge, I think, with conductors. You might agree that the instrument on all of the saxophones, the tablature, the key work is exactly the same, and all the note names are exactly the same. So when we move from instrument to instrument, a C is a C, a B is a B, an A is an A. They're just sounding in different registers and sounding in different transpositions. So Adolphe Sax designed two separate families. One that was intended for the concert band. These were going to be instruments keyed in B flat and E flat, and that was all the rage to write for horns and trumpets and cornets and all of that. And then there would be an orchestral family that he devised that would be in F and C, and that would conform with all of your, that would conform with the horns and all of the C instruments in the orchestra. The C and F family didn't really take, and there were a couple of instruments built in that family, the C soprano, which Ravel originally wrote for in Bolero, and something called the F mezzo soprano, which sits as sort of the alto range. But those instruments didn't really catch on in the end. The F and B flat family caught on simply because of the rise of popularity of the wind band. The 19th century was the hotbed of time for the wind band to rise because of the increased nationalism and patriotic functions around the world in various countries. But it was the wind band instrumentation that benefited from Adolphe Sax inventions, primarily because of the time King Louis Philippe in 1846 granted a national patent for all of Adolphe Sax's instruments, and he decreed that the French regiment bands, the infantry bands, would be outfitted with Adolphe Sax instruments, and and the rest, they say, is history, because John Philip Sousa followed in that, Patrick Gilmore, all of these figures of the wind band movement adopted the European model that came from France.
Now, for Sousa, you'd want to be a soprano saxophone player and not a baritone. Is that correct?
Yeah,
marching down the street.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're going to be a little tough on the neck,
Tim, would you do us a favor now? Would you demonstrate the alto first so we get that standard sound of what we're used to hearing?
Sure. I'm going to switch to my playing mic, so my speaking might be a little lower level. Just overwhelmed there. See if you can see me here. I might have to sit up a little bit. But the alto saxophone, I think of as the primary solo instrument and the instrument that I specialize in the most as a soloist. I'm going to change this here. This might help, actually. All right. Here, I think that will help our audience see the instrument a little bit more. So the alto saxophone is in E flat. This is the instrument you start on generally. If you're in, say, 6th grade, some people might start as early as 4th grade. I didn't start that young. I started in 6th grade. And its range intersects with basically the clarinet, but it doesn't go as high as the clarinet.
Beautiful.
So the earliest sounds that audiences heard from the saxophone, probably even earlier, late 1800s, was Bizet, the Laerlesian suites, which are achingly gorgeous. You know, those solos. So
Gorgeous.
these were
Gorgeous.
But these were the sounds of this. For these composers, the saxophone was somehow the sound of the bourgeois, you know, the sound of the streets in many ways.
Now, are there schools of thought, schools of training? Is there the Parisian sound? Is there a German school of saxophone?
And we saw those kind of parallel developments in all the instrument world, namely that divide still exists with primarily the clarinet world and the bassoon world. You have French bassoon, German bassoon. Now it's pretty universal that all schools teach the German bassoon. But all of those early Paris concours pieces in the 19th century were in for that French bassoon. It was considered almost more of a virtuoso instrument, you know.
So not only would he hear the sax at the Paris Conservatory because he was affiliated with that, correct?
Yes, he was the very first teacher of any instrument. I mean, how convenient. A man invents this instrument, and the king decides that we need to have a school to teach the instrument. So he becomes the person to do it. And he creates the first class at the Paris Conservatory. And what came with that was the annual composition contest to create the competition piece for the classes every year. So the end of the year examinations were original compositions. Wow. So Adolphe Sax was publishing all of this music himself. So he created an entire profession in a vacuum, and it's really quite. I don't think we could see that happen today. I don't think we can imagine someone simply inventing an instrument and immediately having a repertoire being created for it, and then finding it to become mainstreamed.
That's amazing.
Well, but so now we would still say today there is kind of a French school that emanates from the Paris Conservatory, but the class at the Paris Conservatory is incredibly international. I have 2 students in my class now at the University of Michigan that just came from the Paris Conservatory. One is Russian, the other one is Chinese, and they both were at the Paris Conservatory at the same time. So the instrument is truly globalizing in terms of these teaching styles and the sound of the instrument. I mean, the instrument I currently play, I mean, this is a Henry Selmer saxophone. This is a French instrument, built entirely in France, in Paris. So that's had an influence. The French school does dominate the view on the planet, but within that, we've seen an American style emerge. We've seen a proliferation of a German type school that was founded by players that may have lived there and has some kind of corollary with the clarinet world. So it's maybe a darker instrument, and in some cases an instrument that's much older. The players that might conform to what we would call a German school.
Right. Your style of playing with that beautiful vibrato leans which way?
I think it would be a hybrid. It's sort of more of a vintage Parisian sound that's matched with sort of an American populism. You know, I don't know what we call that anymore. It's all been kind of transmigrating, but I think the American school was always. When we talk about some of these figures, you and I collaborated on this beautiful Paul Creston concerto, And the person who premiered that was a gentleman named Vinny Abato, who was bass clarinetist in the New York Symphony Orchestra, and he was teaching clarinet and classical saxophone at Juilliard School. Well, Vincent Abato was playing all over New York, and he was really popularizing the saxophone. And when we think of his style of classical saxophone playing, it actually didn't have much difference in sound to the jazz players at the time. So we see a little bit more of a romantic and kind of almost commercial view of the instrument define the American sound. I think we see this in all kinds of music, right? I mean, American composers have really found a perfect way to blend that. So I would call my playing much more akin to what something Bernstein would like, versus what maybe composers in France would have liked 20 years ago. So I call that now the American hybrid.
Wonderful. Could we listen to another color of saxophone?
Sure.
How about the baritone?
Okay, yeah, we can go.
Which I think would be a real treat to get on and off the subway every morning in your commute to work, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think my reed probably a little dry on this, but let me switch over again to my other microphone here. That's better. Oh, I'm a little tall now. So the baritone, little extended key work. The baritone goes a little bit lower. It has one additional key than the alto saxophone. So the instrument, it can be seen as having an extended range if we begin to implement, the extreme altissimo. So composers have taken advantage of that, but we would call that the extended range. But if
Understood.
you factor in that range all the way down to the low A, the instrument
That's great.
got the most range of all the saxophones. So
That's great.
in the jazz world, we most closely associate the baritone sax with the great Jerry Mulligan, and when we think about, there are players that became strictly associated with those instruments. Stan Getz and the tenor saxophone, Charlie Parker and the alto saxophone, and Jerry Mulligan on the baritone saxophone. In the classical world, we are often called upon to be as good on all the instruments as possible across the board. You say yes to the gig and the instrument it calls for.
That's terrific. Could we hear the very opposite of this now, the soprano?
Sure. So again, the soprano now does actually intersect with the clarinet in its range, but it doesn't go as low as the clarinet. A little cold in here today in my basement. I wish I was in Kentucky right now, or Florida, wherever you are. I have no idea where you are ever. Okay. But yeah, the soprano probably is thought of as being the most agile, It has a nice floating range, has kind of a nice tessitura, very much like the clarinet. When we think about that iconic bolero excerpt, it sits in a really nice part of the instrument.
Bravo, bravo. Very beautiful, and thank you for doing that. So we've heard the wide range. It's really amazing. Vocal colors, just like the human voice. It's really wonderful. Timothy, now I know when you're not recording and winning Grammys with the London Symphony, you keep yourself pretty busy because you are like the #1 call for orchestras when they have a piece of music that they need somebody that come in and nail it down? I know you're working with big orchestras like San Francisco. Can you just give us an idea of what other orchestras you're on speed dial with?
Well, I mean, I think my most enduring relationship with one of those that top tier would be with Los Angeles Philharmonic, and I'm very lucky to have had. I'm muted on accident. I'm very lucky to have had a relationship that now goes back with the LA Philharmonic, goes back to 2009 when they invited me to perform in the world premiere of this large work by John Adams called City Noir, which was a 35-minute, 40 minutes beautiful symphony, but in name, that John Adams wrote as a kind of love letter to the great film noir culture of Los Angeles. And he felt that it was impossible to write a piece like that without having that saxophone color, that was part of those all of those soundtracks, those famous soundtracks in films. And I was very fortunate to get the call to play that and it coincided with Gustavo Dudamel's first week on the job with the Los Angeles Philharmonic. So it brought a lot of attention and press to the event and the piece itself. And little by little, it just led to me getting called by other groups, subsequent groups, to play that piece. Little by little, John Adams wrote a concerto for me. I ended up playing that. I've continued to play that all around the world. But I'd say the orchestras I'm most connected with would be Los Angeles, Chicago, and then I have a premiere that was delayed because of COVID that's coming up, will be coming up next season, with the San Francisco Symphony, and that will be a brand new concerto by the great American composer John Corigliano. And this concerto is amazing, and it's not only because that it's Corigliano, but he's asking me to play 3 of these saxophones in the concerto. So in this concerto, the first movement is for the soprano saxophone, the second movement is for the alto saxophone, and the third movement is the biggest movement, and it's for the baritone saxophone. And then he has me do this outrageous thing at the very end of the concerto. He has me go right back to the soprano saxophone to play the very end of it, which is some of the highest, craziest stuff. So if audiences are familiar with Corigliano's clarinet concerto, there's some elements to this piece that kind of call back to that iconic work for him that probably, arguably, launched his career. So I'm very excited about that. And it would have taken place, the premiere would have taken place 2 weeks ago. And it's been a long process with him working through the piece and the sketches, but they're now tentatively getting it reprogrammed for late next season, which
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. I mean, we're talking about A-list composers writing for you specifically. That's really terrific. As a matter of fact, the first time the piece you premiered, the Adams piece with LA, is the first thing I heard you ever play. John Carlo Guerra invited me up to a rehearsal in Nashville. And you were tearing it apart. It was unbelievable. I mean, it was like you said it's a symphony in style, but it was really a saxophone concerto. You just happened to be sitting in the back.
Yeah,
It was ridiculously difficult and so beautiful. So that's the first time I heard you.
Wow.
And it's been uphill from there because it's just gotten better and better and better. And you're advancing the repertoire with these great composers, and that's got to be really quite a compliment.
Well, thank you. You're very kind. Thank you. Yeah.
Listen, let's talk about one last thing. You also believe in education. I know that you're at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor there, and you have a strong studio, and you're churning out great players that come to you from all over the world. Like you said, Paris Conservatory, then they come to you. Also, in the summertime, you're not playing golf, you're teaching at Interlaken. Mm-hmm. Which we hung out to for a while also there. So would you share with us the importance of music in children's lives and how it could make everything better for them, how we can learn life skills through it and go from there? Because there's probably some parents and grandparents and even maybe children listening now. How can we get them involved and show them that music is a beautiful life? And music is a beautiful way of living and sharing and making the world a better place.
Well, I'm certain the research alone is ironclad, that music benefits the brain, it benefits the developmental brain. And The role of music in schools, I think there are advocates all over this world to make sure that it sits there right alongside mathematics and literature and science and everything. We have to always make that case. I think advocacy in the public schools is crucial, and I don't think every child is necessarily has to feel destined to make this their career. Maybe it's part of a literate functioning society that there's some base level of knowledge about music and art, and I think civilization has benefited at every turn where that has been the case. I of course I'm involved in my job is training, the future performers of tomorrow that might try to fill my shoes at one point. I still believe that there's always that wonderful place for the amateur musician. There are so many safe places for them to make music in our community bands, community orchestras, community schools, and we have to champion that. Just recently, one of my former students who studied with me 25 years ago as a private student, a private saxophone student at a local high school, he got back in contact with me about 3 months ago that said, after a life of aerospace engineering and working for NASA and now working for SpaceX and all of that, he got back to me and said, I'm picking the instrument up again. What suggestions, it's been a long time and I'm looking to modernize a new mouthpiece, and can you help me out because I've fallen in love with it again.
Wow.
And what a powerful message of the importance of music at the point in his life where it gave him some skill sets that actually probably helped elevate him in a job process or a school application process, where they look at this diversity of an applicant and they say someone has music training and maybe it helps them. But to come back to it, and now he wants to play again, and he's playing in a local adult community band. That's the power of music, is that it's with you your whole life. And if anything, if we walk away from it, it nags at us, it pulls on us like a thread on our coat that we want to get rid of. So I think everyone deserves to have that chance to where it would have that kind of appeal in their life. And not everyone is destined for the music school, curriculum or careers in music. And even those that do, they have to be smart and savvy, and they have to be worldly, and they have to now, all these buzzwords now, entrepreneurs, they have to be advocates, and also they've got to tie in elements of activism, both social and cultural activism, in order to have any chance at a music career. And I'm speaking, outside of our COVID pandemic. Although music continues to find its way, right? I mean, I think this is a beautiful thing. We are still seeing music finding its way. And if we were to interview poets and visual artists and composers from 100 years ago in the horrible world wars and the previous pandemic, they're all going to say the same thing, that art found a way. So I believe in it with every fabric of my being, and I'm just as passionate about my role in shaping young people's dreams and goals without necessarily tracking them to be professional musicians. And that's why I love Interlochen so much, the summer camp you mentioned, because maybe one or two out of the class of students I'll have every summer, maybe one or two of them will go on to go either into music school or to have careers in music. But every single one of them finds music as a major part of their life. And I think that's our job. That's your job. That's my job. I think there's no greater calling.
I think that's beautiful. Couldn't have said it better. And I want to say thank you to you, Tim, because music makes the world better. And thank you for all your contribution. You are amazing on every level, and it's a joy to know you. Thank you for your time, Tim.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Maestro. It's wonderful to work with you.
Ciao. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.